Hi everybody and welcome to English for You. I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're looking at how using Google can actually, of course, it's great for us,
yes,
but it can sometimes cause problems for real and much smaller companies and businesses. What do you mostly Google when you Google?
I guess when I use Google, it's mostly sort of for local information that I can't find easily. You know, things that are going on around me, places to go. The last thing I think I Googled was a local restaurant, and I just went on Google to find out when it would be open, what the hours were, and if it was going to be closed on Sunday. It's really useful for up-to-date information about things right near you. So
yeah,
that's
definitely
what I use it for most. What about you?
I do a lot of work-related searches about very boring small grammar points to find out what, you know, is it this or this? What do experts say? What is common use? That kind of thing to answer questions. I also do some odd searches in my spare time for my writing hobby, like unusual things like how does somebody die from electricity if a lightning struck a bit of wire they were holding?
Good question.
Or what happens when people eat a certain leaf that's grown up in the mountains in South America? Or what does gun smoke actually smell like?
That's true. I don't know. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
So you're kind of using it for research. You're using it like your local library.
A little, yeah.
And I'm kind of using it like my local newspaper or a local bulletin board for you know, events and a guidebook kind of thing like that. So there you go. It's useful for all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, the fact that it's so useful and so many people kind of go there first to find stuff is affecting other companies that used to provide this sort of information.
Right.
And we're going to read about that in today's article. Let's check it out.
Reading.
How Google is killing local news. Local news outlets have been disappearing rapidly across the U.S. Many media experts believe that Google is to blame. To collect data about Google's effect on local news, some researchers from the US and Singapore conducted an experiment. They did 2 sets of searches on Google News to discover how results from local news outlets were shown. About 96,000 searches were made. The first set was for local topics such as mayor. The second was for national topics, such as president. Upon inspecting the results for local topics, the researchers observed that Google News listed national outlets first almost 74% of the time. This has negative effects. For instance, people searching for early voting in the last US election would have been looking for places to vote in their neighborhoods. National media didn't carry those details. Often, the researchers had to look through 2 pages of results before they found a local outlet. This means it's unlikely that people will visit these news outlets, which makes it difficult for them to survive.
So the article starts by explaining what the problem actually is. It says, local news outlets have been disappearing rapidly across the US. So a news outlet is any kind of news organization. It could sell papers, it could have a website where it puts its news, maybe it has a radio or a TV news show, and if it's a local one, it's maybe just in that state in the US, maybe even just that kind of area of group of counties.
I see.
You know, this part of the state just has this newspaper, that kind of thing. It's not they're not talking the big national CNN, that is a news outlet, but it's a big one, whereas they're talking like kind of small, maybe just a city newspaper, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it was very common, right, for each city or even a small town to have their local newspaper, radio station, television stations, maybe a few of them, even in small towns. But then we read many media experts believe that Google is to blame. So Google is to blame for these small media groups, these small TV stations or local newspapers. They are to blame for many of them disappearing or basically going out of business. When we say something is to blame, to be to blame, this phrase is basically pointing at something and saying that's why we have this problem. We're showing the responsibility for something, generally something that's gone badly, a mistake, an accident, something that didn't work out, and you're saying, oh, it wasn't me, it was that person or that thing. You could blame a machine for breaking down, you could blame a person for making you late, you can blame bad luck for bad things that go on. But if it's a result of what they did or the actions of that thing, then that thing is to blame. So Google is the one we point at when all the local radio and TV stations are going out of business. It's Google's fault.
But is that accurate? Is that true? Well, people kind of wanted to find out, so they did some work. The article says, to collect data about Google's effect on local news, some researchers from the US and Singapore conducted an experiment. So they wanted to find out about the effects of Google. The effects of something, and this is a noun, so it's spelt with the E, not the verb, spelt with an A. Effect, not affect. The effect is what is caused by an action. It's how something is affected. It's some kind of change, so you do this and this happens, that's the effect. For example, we could say, exercising before work has a positive effect on my mood, so I do it every day. You exercise and the effect is you feel great, you feel better about yourself, the world, the day you're going to have.
And next we have this noun researcher, or as it's sometimes pronounced, researcher. Well, research, without the ER on the end, is basically the information and data that scientists and other people get when they study something really carefully. They learn about it, they do tests, they collect information. That's doing research. So if you're a person doing research, you are a researcher. You could be a scientist, you could be a student in the library. You're kind of a researcher because you're finding out information. But generally we use this for people like scientists, people who work in labs or maybe at universities, and it's pretty much their full-time job, gathering data or information on any kind of topic you can imagine, from history to science to engineering, all sorts of stuff. We need information, and the people who go out and study it and learn it and bring it to us to tell us about, they are researchers. For example, researchers found that most young people today rarely use their smartphones to make telephone calls.
All right, so these researchers, they're in the US where it's happening, and they're in Singapore, you know, because Singapore's a small place with a lot of news, so I guess maybe it's just a good place to do some research.
True, or maybe a university there just decided, we're going to do research on this topic.
Going to look into this. And they conducted an experiment. To conduct something means to organize and carry out a particular activity. It's often something like research, an experiment, some kind of survey. Basically, you plan it out. We're going to do this, 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 and this. You do the activity, and then you look at the results. It's the whole thing. So we use the word conduct for experiment, survey. We could also say carry out. We carry out an experiment or something like that. You can say do, we did an experiment, but that word's really not as good as using the word conduct.
There you go. So, how did they conduct their research to find out on the effect of Google News or Google on local news? It says they did 2 sets of searches on Google News to discover how results from local news outlets were shown. So basically, just like you and I, they would look up things on Google News, things that the local newspapers or radio stations, TV stations would cover. That's the first step of their research. Now we have this word search. Here we're using search as a noun. Of course, generally we would use it as a verb. To search for something is to look for something, probably quite carefully because it's not an easy thing to find. But when you do a search, most of the time these days we're talking about typing a question or information we need into something like Google and looking for results, looking for answers, looking for information. I guess you could say the police did a search for the missing person, something like that. But for most of us in our daily lives, when you say, I'm going to do a search, it means you're going to go on Google and look for some information. For example, Becky used Google to do a search for an Italian restaurant in her neighborhood. The kind of thing that millions of people do on Google every day.
Okay, and speaking of big numbers like a million, they did a big number. We see in the article about 96,000 searches were made.
Wow.
So they would have hired people, maybe a few kind of students, just to go, all right, guys, we need you to sit there and make 96,000 searches. So you guys do 1,000 a day and we'll give you some money. That's basically how that data is created. They have to do all that work. And there's another use of search as a noun. Now, they did two sets of searches, so two different kinds of ideas here.
That's right. Remember, they're checking the difference between sort of local news and international or national or international news. So the first set of these searches the first set was for local topics such as mayor. So they're talking about the mayor. That's basically the political leader of a city, not of a country, but of a city. That very much means it's a local news story.
Yeah, you want to know what the mayor's doing about it, which is important for that city in that area. But the entire country, especially one the size of the US, it's not going to be a big deal unless it's related to a major national story.
Sure, or the mayor of New York might be a national story, but the mayor of Columbus, Ohio.
Right, maybe not so much.
No.
So that was the first set. We see in the article that the second, meaning the second set of searches, was for national topics such as president. Okay, yeah, this makes sense. This is a pretty logical way. Mayor is mostly going to be local stories. President is going to be national ones.
There you go. So what did they find? It says, upon inspecting the results for local topics, the researchers observed that Google News listed national outlets first almost 74% of the time. Now that seems a little strange when you look at the search results from these local searches for the mayor of a small town, but most of the news stories that popped up were national news stories or from CNN or things like that, and not from the local TV or newspaper. That's a little strange. And it wasn't just a little bit, and it also wasn't just about big cities. About all the local mayor searches, 74% of the time, the news they got first at the top came from a national news source.
Yeah, so every 3 out of 4, if you look at the links that you search on Google, most of those links, 3 out of 4, or maybe the top 15 out of 20, are for a national news website, not just like, the Columbus, Ohio news, kind of local one like that. So we'll talk about what that means in a moment. First, we have a little bit of grammar to take a look at. So the grammar that this sentence used was the use of the word upon and then a V-I-N-G verb form. So like upon doing, upon inspecting, upon waking up, that kind of pattern. And this grammar pattern is used to mean when somebody did that thing. When they do this thing, and then we follow it up with what happens after. What's the result of doing the first thing? Upon inspecting the data, this is what they found. So it's kind of a sequence kind of pattern. We now see an example sentence for this. Upon opening the door, I saw that my house had been broken into. So first you open the door, and as soon as that happens, you can tell that thieves have been in your house. So right, they did this, they looked at the data, so we say upon inspecting. That was a thing they did first. They inspected the data.
That's right. And when you inspect something, this verb is basically saying you're looking at something, you're checking something quite carefully. You really want to get as much information out of this. You don't want to miss things or go too quickly, so you skip over things. When you inspect something, you're looking at it from all sides. You're taking your time. You're not just giving it a quick look and then moving on with your life. No, you're taking some time to get as much information. So when they're inspecting the data, they're really studying it. They're comparing it to other places. They're trying different searches. They're getting as much information and then learning learning about that information as much as they can by checking it out very, very carefully, by inspecting it. For example, pilots always walk around their aircraft to inspect it before getting ready to fly. Yeah, they always walk around, make sure everything's, in the right place and all the little hatches are closed. You have to do that carefully, inspect your plane before you fly. And as you inspect things, you also observe things.
Right, though, using our grammar pattern, upon inspecting it, they observed this. To observe means to notice or to see. As you're kind of looking over it with your eyes, you pick up on a detail and you go, aha, I've seen this. I'll remember this detail. It maybe stands out. It's not something I'm going to immediately forget. For example, we could say, the security guard observed a strange man walking around the parking lot. So they saw the guy, this security guard said, oh, I've seen him, he's walking around a bit strange. I'm going to remember that. So what they observed was that Google was listing the national outlets first.
That's right, for the local news searches. Now, as the article says next, this has negative effects, all right? So this can lead to some bad things happening. This isn't a good situation, having all the local news, the national news people reporting on the local news stories.
Right, so here's an example of how it can go wrong. The article says, for instance, people searching for early voting in the last US election would have been looking for places to vote in their neighborhoods. That's what you might do. You'd go, all right, I want to vote early. Where can I do that? Search for early voting. You'd want some local source telling you where to do it. Okay, what the process is. Maybe if you get a national source, though, it'll be something like millions in the US expected to early vote. That doesn't give you the information.
Yeah.
Now, in that sentence, we use the phrase for instance, which means the same as for example. We use it to start a sentence or to start a clause when we want to give an example or show how something works.
That's right. And we also had that word election, right? We just came through an election in the US. I'm sure you saw that on the news. An election, this noun, is basically when you choose your politicians, when you choose your leaders through voting. So they pick a day in the calendar, people go down, they line up, they get a piece of paper called a ballot, they put a mark next to the person they want to win the election, the person they want to become the mayor, the president, the local politician. And that whole process, that day of voting, when everyone goes down and then they count the votes and come up with a winner, that is the election. For example, kings aren't usually chosen through an election. No, presidents and mayors and things, but kings, no, they aren't chosen through an election.
No, that is true. So we see in the article, national media didn't carry those details. A CNN report wouldn't have said, if you live in Columbus, Ohio, where can you go to do some early voting? It just wouldn't bother with such small details. It's looking at the big picture.
Right. So if you want to get international, national news, Google is a great place to go. But if you need local information, it's really not doing the job. It says often the researchers had to look through 2 pages of results before they found a local outlet. That's kind of crazy. So if you're looking for local voting, CNN, New York Times, the BBC, some other international newspaper or TV station, 2 pages of this before you find the local thing that gives you the local information that you're actually looking for.
So people had to look through and scroll down these 2 pages of Google results to find a local news outlet link. And as the article says, this means it's unlikely that people will visit these news outlets, which makes it difficult for them to survive. So no one's clicking on those links to the local news outlet, so if no one visits that page, they get no money from advertising, which is important. And I guess it also means that people won't remember them and then go, there's no point in listening to their news or buying their paper. So no business for the news outlet.
Absolutely. And also not good for the local community. If people don't know about things like voting or local news, local events, it doesn't help the community any either. So there you go. A lot of reasons why this sort of giving more importance to the big national news sources places is not good for everyone, no matter where you live, especially in smaller towns.
Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a chat about that in our For You Chat question, so let's go there now.
For You Chat.
So today's chat question is, can you think of some other ways Google might help or harm small businesses?
Well, I think kind of in the same way with media, when you talk about shopping on the internet too.
Yeah.
A lot of those big e-retailers, your Amazons, your PC Homes.
Shopee.
When you search for something, right, they often pop up first, and it's nice and easy, and you can click and order what you want. The local stores right in your neighborhood, maybe you haven't driven by, and maybe it's, around the corner somewhere, they might sell what you're looking for, but kind of like the local newspapers in the article we read, they get pushed down maybe onto the second page of searches. So, it is convenient to shop online, but it's also nice to give the business to your local neighborhood.
Yeah, the same is true of restaurants. If a restaurant kind of sets up and gets itself on Google Maps, has a website, has some information, then yeah, it's good. People can find it. So you Google like Italian restaurant, you might see there are more than you knew about. So you can check some of the different ones out. But think of a small vendor, a tiny noodle shop, a little sort of hole-in-the-wall coffee shop, something like that. They maybe won't show up on Google, so you'll never know about them unless you happen to walk past them. So yeah, if you can use Google, it'll help you. But if you're just that small, then maybe you'll never get on Google, and so people won't know about you. It's getting harder for people to know about things that aren't shoved in their face on the internet. So the small businesses get no business. So I guess it's a question of using Google well or not.
Absolutely.
And that applies to a lot of things.
Definitely. And doing some of your own research, knowing about the local news that's going on. You might have to work a little bit harder than just doing a quick Google search.
Exactly. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again soon. For English For You, I'm Pat.
I'm Mike.
Talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Vocabulary Review.
Effect. The disease spread around the world and had a big effect on the industries of many countries. Researcher. Researchers from the university tried to find out the history of the local castle, but information was hard to get. Search. Bonnie wanted to go on vacation, so she did a search on the internet for cheap plane tickets. Inspect. When Steve inspected his train ticket more closely, he realized that he was sitting in the wrong seat. Observe. The woman looked at the sick bird and observed that its wing was broken. Election. The president felt confident before the election, but in the end, she only won by a few votes.
智慧小补帖
News outlet. Conduct.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作。活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net